last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and the mercy of Allah be upon you, and welcome to Hadith Principles. This is like a class in which we study the principles which help us to research and understand the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The Hadith are the important second source of Islamic teaching, and very valuable information that all Muslims need in guidance of our beliefs and practices of Islam. We have with us today on our panel Brother Muhammad from Egypt and Brother Muhammad from America and Brother Ilyas, also from the United States. Inshallah, this is going to be interesting and useful. If you guys recall, we were talking in the last program about the different stages in which the Hadith studies took place. And each stage had its particular situation and circumstances. And so if you recall, the first stage was the time of the companions, the Sahaba, the first century of Islam. And it was really an ideal stage for memorizing and recording the Hadiths and passing them on to the next generation because of that, the special characteristics of the educational methods of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as the enthusiasm and seriousness and devotion of his companions. The next stage was more of the stage of completion of the corpus or body of Hadith, and that lasted from the second to the middle of the 3rd century in Islam. And that's when the earliest works, written works of the Quran, of the Hadith, were compiled. Hadiths before that had been compiled by individual companions and their students. But then authors started completing the work of writing Hadith, as well as the beginnings of the criticism of those people when there were divisions within the Islamic world who were making forgeries or were inaccurate in their memorization or preservation of the Hadith. Those things were exposed by very great scholars during that second period. And especially in the third period, which we call the time of Tadween, when all of the Hadiths of the Prophet were recorded in very important works that have been passed down to us today. And that is from the 3rd to the 4th centuries of the Islamic era. And that's really the golden era of Hadith. A lot of famous collections, which all Muslims ought to know, were written in that period. We have the 2 famous books called the Sahihain, Al-Bukhari and Muslim, as well as the 4 famous books called the Sunan, Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah. But there were other books that people, they're not so famous except for in scholarly circles among people who are specialists who have studied Islamic studies. So for example, there are books called Sahih, also Ibn Hibban and Ibn Khuzaymah come to mind. And also, books were written recording the names of the narrators of Hadith, those people whose names were in the chains of narration. So, a scholar in that generation heard a Hadith from his sheikh or his teacher, and he heard it from one of the tabi'een. And that person heard it perhaps from another one of the tabi'een, the second generation, and they heard it from one of the Sahaba. And so that became the chain or isnad of the Hadith. And every person in that Hadith, it's important to know, to verify when they lived, if they were actually good students, if they were memorized and they were trustworthy and of good character, and whether their narrations could be trusted and were accurate. Even sometimes people of good character and who are good Muslims aren't accurate in their knowledge or memory, or they record, for example, hadiths in writing, and then they lose their writing through an accident or through a fire or some other means. So all that information, biographical data, was very important. That was collected in by early scholars in that era. And one of the most famous is Yahya ibn Ma'in, whose book is still extant and is very, very useful. The Tabaqa is a famous book by Muhammad ibn Sa'ad, and Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, of course, in this subject. And also in the Ilal, which are the hidden defects of the hadith that we're going to talk about later, and Nasikh and Mansukh. It's very important for people to understand those. At the same time, the principles that we're going to be talking about, the principles of hadith, were being studied and implemented, and they were written down, but not all in one volume in of the form that we know today when you buy a book about hadith sciences or study a book about the principles of hadith. So you'll find those books were recorded by, for example, Imam Shafi'i, because he was the founder of the Usul, Foundations of Islamic Jurisprudence. He wrote about the methodology of the hadith scholars in Risala. Imam Muslim in the Sahih, his famous collection of hadith, writes about the hadith principles. And you have to realize there's a difference between the hadith principles and the hadith themselves. The hadith principles show us how to analyze and use and benefit from those hadiths, how to sift between that which is authentic and that which is not authentic. And so at this period, most of the imams used those hadith principles, but they didn't actually write books about them. And some of them were deduced later, like the principles of Imam Bukhari were deduced by other scholars from the writings of Imam al-Bukhari. But it was in the fourth period, especially, when most of the famous books started getting written about the hadith principles. And that is from the middle of the 3rd century to the 7th century. And so famous scholars like Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and Qadi Ayyad and Nisapuri and Isfahani, all of them were involved heavily in analyzing the hadith and analyzing each reporter. The isnads had become very long, and there were so many people. It took real experts to know who are all these people, and they memorized literally and knew thousands of the rijal, or the persons who are involved in the isnad, in the passing down of the hadith from generation to generation. In this situation, they really needed very strict discipline in the study of hadith, and it became really a scientific endeavor, really massive scale at that time in the world. And so this classification of the hadith, what they call mustalah al-hadith, was really the work of that fourth era, that fourth stage. One of the earliest works covering this area is Rama Hormuzi, and the next ones that are really famous at that time are Ma'arifat al-Ulum, Ulum al-Hadith by al-Hakim, and Abu Nu'aym al-Isbahani, and Khatib al-Baghdadi's book, Ilm al-Riwaya. Al-Khatib's work especially was very seminal, and a lot of other people benefited, and they wrote books discussing and using the information from that book and adding additional information to it. Finally, by the 5th level, through the 7th to 10th centuries, the last great hadith scholars lived who completed the scientific study of the hadith and passed that down to all of us. Because they were the later generation, they benefited from all of the information before and really compiled it together and analyzed it, the books which were written by Islamic scholars that contained da'if hadiths. In that era, instead of having to, for example, they started annotating the books. So you'll find a famous book like Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam Ghazali. And so they annotated and pointed out which hadiths are da'if in that book. And many other books were annotated in that way by famous scholars at that time, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and others. The most important book in the hadith principles written at that time, and maybe even till today, is the book of Ibn Salah, Ulum al-Hadith. And Ibn Salah died in the 7th century of Islam. And he compiled that book from many different sources while he was a student of the hadith. And it is basically considered the most important single work. And all the scholars after that really depended on him. And they would write abridgments of his work and annotated editions. And so all the famous scholars after him benefited greatly by Imam Ibn Salah. Muqaddimah al-Irshad of An-Nawawi, At-Taqrib of Suyuti, many other important books depended on that. Ikhtisar Ulum al-Hadith of Ibn Kathir, many others, Badr al-Din ibn Jama'a, Al-Muqni', many other books at that time, which are basically the textbooks written by scholars of each school of thought in each era of the principles of hadith that we're really going to be studying in detail. Al-Iraqi wrote his commentary and notes on Ibn Salah, as did Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. The Alfiya al-Hadith of Iraqi, by putting these principles in sort of a rhymed form, it made it easy to remember. So 1,000 rules you needed to know in studying hadith, basically everything you needed to know to study hadith, made it rhyme, and then you had to memorize that. And then if you memorize that, then you would recall the rhyme, then you would remember the comments of your teachers about it. So people wrote those comments down in commentaries on the Alfiya. And so they would remember this one line of the poem, and then they could remember all of the detailed discussion of that subject. And so this fifth era ended finally in the 10th century, and it began really the last era before modern time, the sixth stage, and that's called really the stage of stagnation. During that period, after the Islamic world had gone through the attacks of the Mongols, the Crusades, really there was a lot of political division. People felt that Islam had been complete, the hadith had been complete, the studies had been completed. They felt that the gates of ijtihad or independent reasoning should now be closed, not allow anybody else to like monkey around with the studies of Islam. And they felt that every problem had already been solved and analyzed by the scholars. And so people didn't emphasize hadith studies. They would just narrate hadiths and often didn't even say whether those were authentic or weak. And it was really at stage of decline until about 100 years ago or more when it started being revived again. We're going to go to a break and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. So is it logical to say all plastic surgeries are lawful in Islam to bring or to regain beauty? It is very misleading questions. Need a very accurate and firm answers. Let us set up the rules and principles to cover all plastic surgeries in Islamic law. How Islam does legalize niqab or veil factor in our modern life? Is it fair to suggest that it is more cultural than it is Islamic? I would rather to answer these questions by just suggesting very shocking fact about niqab. Are you ready for that? How Islam does legalize polygamy when Islam always says that respect natural instinct and natural feelings, and knowing that not a single woman does accept anyone to share her in her kingdom. All what you have said is true. But is there any difference between your natural instinct and your natural desires? Or maybe between your interest or what you wish to have? Or maybe your interest and other interest? Is it true that anything came after the Prophet ﷺ regarding this deen to be considered as a bid'ah, innovation? It's neither this nor that. It seems very well complicated and confusing to many Muslims, especially when it comes to the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, وَكُلَّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ, and Sayyidina Umar saying, نِعْمَةُ الْبِدْعَةُ هَذِهِ. Let us set up the very comprehensive
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're talking about the different stages in the study of hadith in the world today. Let's go and review a couple of these things for us and write them down just for our memory. The first stage, of course, was the companions. And that was really the ideal environment for the memorization and recording and preservation of the hadith. What's the next level called?
Tabi'in.
Okay, what's the thing about that era?
The Sahaba died.
Yes, and now there was division, and they had to be very careful about the authentication of hadith.
Mm-hmm.
And so real authentication, and the first big works of collections of hadith were written. What's the third era called?
The era of Tadween.
Yeah, the Tadween, that is when the hadiths were recorded in the famous collections that are widely published. That's called the golden era of the famous collections like Imam Bukhari, golden age or golden era. The fourth era...
It's like a culmination or the completion.
Yeah, exactly. It was like the completion of this stage. And what they did then is starting to really work on the principles of how you analyze the hadith. These books were just containing hadiths, but they wanted to know what are the principles that the ulama of hadith used, and what do we need to know in the study of hadith, inshallah. And this fifth era is the time that the great ulama wrote the famous books of the hadith science or hadith studies, famous hadith principle books, like Ibn Salah, Ibn Hajar al-Iraqi, and many, hundreds of scholars. It was a huge effort through all these stages. And what's the last era there, the sixth?
Stagnation.
Yeah, kind of stagnation up until 150 years ago or so. A lot of people were neglecting the era of hadith. And really the era we're in now started, maybe 150 years ago, or where really there was a revival in the study. You can even say even 200 years ago, depending on where you're at. There were famous scholars studying hadith, and for example, in Yemen, As-San'ani, Ash-Shawkani, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, for example, really revived hadith study in Arabia. And scholars also, many in India, reviving that. And then all over the world, hadith studies became really reinvigorated in the last 100 years in Islamic world, where people have reapplied themselves to understanding the hadiths, inshallah, bidnillah. So what do you guys think about these eras? Does it help, to understand that the different kinds of books were all dependent on the different era that they were in and kind of the conditions at the time?
I got a question.
Yeah.
The golden era, was that the time when there's, in I guess the land where Iraq is now, where all the learning was, and is that?
It wasn't just Iraq. It was a worldwide effort. During that era, famous hadith scholars were compiling the hadith in comprehensive works. A lot of that took place in Iraq, because that was the center of the Abbasid dynasty. A lot of the ulama of hadith were from Central Asia, Khorasan, between Iraq and Iran and Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, that area. But those areas later on, they were destroyed by the Mongols, and they never revived the study of hadith on that level again in those eras. And they were really centers. And all the way even to North Africa, even into Spain, of course, famous hadith scholars in Spain wrote very, very valuable works in that era.
Is there a difference between narrating and relating?
Well, it says in English, I'm not sure. In the Arabic, there's specific terminology. We're actually going to study in some later episodes specific terminology about it. But when we say narrate, it may sound to some people like, you're narrating a story, or relating means that you are relating what you have heard maybe in English, and narrate may not have the exact same meaning. But in Arabic, there are words that clearly show that the scholar has heard this directly and is narrating it directly from a particular person. Then there are other words that are less clear, and it could mean that they actually didn't hear it directly from that person. And so those are very important distinctions actually in the Islamic Hadith principles.
I have a question.
Yes.
I just want to clarify the time period of the stagnation to the revival. There was nothing lost. It was just a revival of the study, or
Yeah.
was there anything knowledge-wise lost?
Yes. No, it's not talking about being lost. It's that people didn't see quite the same importance. The books are there, but a lot of advanced students didn't study the advanced level of Hadith sciences. They read the books, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and other books of Hadith. But people would routinely, for example, put Hadiths in books or read them or put them in a khutbah without ascertaining their correctness or authenticity. And they often didn't apply the principles. The huge efforts were made to analyze the Hadith and distinguish what is correct and what is not authentic, and they would just ignore that. So, for example, many of the scholars from the previous level, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, annotated many famous books so that we could see which hadiths in those books were authentic. But then people would ignore that. So it really just wasn't being used. It wasn't that knowledge was lost, it just wasn't being used. And it didn't mean nobody studied it. Some people did study it, but they didn't get a big reception. Most students studied the fiqh of the different schools of thought, and mysticism was very big at that time, following the Sufi mystics, and people didn't give as much importance to studying hadith principles.
Dear Sheikh, as for the principle of hadith, is it known who first introduced the science or the principles of hadith, and on what basis did they build this science? Or in other words, what are the main features of these principles here?
Yeah, well, of course, we're going to talk about them more in detail later, but the beginning of that, it didn't all come at one time, like one person invented all the hadith principles. The beginning of it was in the time of the Prophet and the Sahaba. And the Prophet ﷺ, was very accurate and truthful in conveying and explaining, and he urged us to always ascertain in the Quran and Sunnah. If a person comes to you with information, with a report, then to investigate the authenticity of those statements. And so it's part of Islam. It's a basic Islamic principle to authenticate something. And so, as was mentioned previously, when a Sahabi would narrate a hadith to another Sahabi who hadn't heard about it, and they had some question, they would investigate to make sure that hadith was correct. And they would ask, did you hear that from the Prophet Muhammad? And they would say, yes, I heard it directly. And they would ask questions, or they would bring other people who would verify. And so the idea of verification is from the time of the Prophet. What happened in the second stage was that there were new people who entered into Islam from old religions, who brought in different ideas and philosophies. And Islam became, there were political wars and disputes and divisions in religion, theological sects that arose, and people would write and make statements attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, which may not have been authentic, and it became necessary to sift that. And so eventually we see people like Ibn Ma'in writing those methodologies. He didn't invent the methodology, he was just writing what the scholars did. The scholars started to say, like Az-Zuhri, where's your proof? When you bring something at that time, in the time of Bani Umayyah, when there was civil war going on, and sects were arising and disputes about who should be the leadership in the Islamic Ummah, they said at that point, we started asking people, what's your source? Name your teacher. Tell us who's giving you. Before that, we used to be very trusting. So the Sahaba and the early Tabi'een, they trusted each other and they would teach each other. Later, we didn't just accept anything because now we knew we had to be very careful about it. And so these were the natural Islamic principles now being put to the test. Then they had to be compiled and studied in a formal way.
So were the lives of the people that I guess were related in the Isnad, were they studied by the scholars? Or
Yeah, mashallah, jazakallah. They compiled all the biographies of all those people. Some biographies are for everybody. Some of them are only for the authentic ones. Some of biographies containing people who invented and fabricated hadiths, the wada or the mawdu' hadith, or those people who are, matrukin or are not trustworthy. And so they would compile those works of the du'afa, the weak people. They may have been good Muslims, but they were weak in memory and weak in conveying the hadiths. So they would record the biographies, the reasons why somebody was known to be a fabricator or a liar. They would put the witness, who said this information about them, when did they live. It's very important to know, for example, who were their teachers and who were their students. So you could see, if I narrate a hadith, is it from did I actually meet that person? Was I one of his students or not? Or maybe I didn't even live in the same country that he did. And so those books, all that information is compiled, and we have access to huge books, like the books of Al-Mizzi, for example, are huge. On my shelf, it's this wide. And so many of the scholars, like Imam Dhahabi, huge books. So today, if you want to spend your life learning all about those people, you will know them better than you know your own friends. I think it's very important for us as Muslims to know that the hadith studies have been the focus of huge efforts at every stage to make sure that all of the hadiths of the Prophet have been guarded and maintained for us, for our sake, by our ulama and by our scholars. They devoted huge efforts in preserving and authenticating and defending the hadiths from people who would fabricate or interpolate or alter their meaning or their wording. So that the Muslim Ummah can be confident that the hadith are a sound, accurate source of knowledge about our faith. It is a great gift for us in Islam. May Allah Almighty guide us and all of you to a better understanding of our religion through the Quran and the hadith. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Quran, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.